That was only sown just over a month ago, 5 weeks ago. It's really important to get the right tree in the right place for the right purpose.
I was once a Trees on Farms Extension Officer with Greening Australia. I was with them for about 10 years, and I've also worked with Landcare. The pattern of planting that a landholder might use has actually changed quite a bit in the last few decades. Once upon a time, landholders were very interested in planting shelter belts, and that was the goal of the planting. So linear plantings along the fence boundary was a very typical farm planting. The goals of landholders have changed now, so that plantings might have a whole range of multiple benefits, and it depends on the focus of that particular planting, on just what sort of an arrangement you might use. So the typical shelter belt, narrow linear corridor planting is still very common. But there are people that plant now in blocks. There are people that plant quite wide patches of riparian areas along streams to help with their goals of managing water quality and biodiversity along streams. There's also a movement towards silver pasture, which is integration of trees with pasture, where the trees might be used for some end use, such as timber or nut production or some other actual tree use, and the benefits of having trees integrated with the pasture might benefit the pasture production and the animal production system as well. So that's where there's wide space trees planted. And there's all sorts of patterns in between. For example, dense shrub layers are an important habitat feature that are absent from a lot of grazing properties. So the introduction of a dense, small patches of shrubs across the landscape can contribute significantly to biodiversity if that's the landholder's goal. And so corners of paddocks might get fenced off in quite small patches and densely planted out to shrubs. So that's another pattern. Of course, there's the engineered woodland approach, which is where a whole paddock is taken out of production, so no extra fencing is required, and the landholder plants a series of belts, clumps, patches to suit their goals for that paddock. Uses best practice establishment practice so that we get those woody plants growing as quickly as possible. And then once the trees are big enough to cope with stock management, the livestock are gradually reintroduced back into the paddock. And that's a relatively new way of doing things. And it's a great way of getting trees established on a whole paddock scale. It depends on the goals of the landholder, because when it comes down to it, trees on farms are planted in an arrangement that matters to the farmer. So they really decide what they want to do and how they should do it. But it's great to see that all these different arrangements and configurations are coming out of the imaginations of landholders these days.
I'm Gordon Williams. We're on the property East Lake, which is situated about 20 odd k's southeast of Uralla, heading back towards Walker. Light metasedimentary country and a little bit of granite as well. 1,200 hectares, and we lease the farm, but normally we run anywhere between 600 and 1,000 head of fattening cattle. Neighbour leases the farm, so the farm has to be productive in terms of producing fat grass-fed cattle or backgrounded cattle. But we've also done a fair bit of revegetation work to improve shelter, but also in later years to improve biodiversity as well, which has been shown to be an important part of agricultural landscapes. We started most of our planting about 35, 37 years ago, and that's been ongoing ever since. Initially our goal was to assist with the dieback situation, just to improve shelter across the farm, shelter for livestock, shelter for pastures.
One of my first jobs with Greening Australia about 20 years ago was to investigate a whole number of plantings across the northern tablelands and northwest slopes. And we were looking specifically at all the factors that might contribute to their success or otherwise. So we looked at the site, the tree species used, how the site was prepared, and what the landholder did in terms of managing them. And what we found on the northern tablelands, that there was 3 key things that determined how well the trees survived and grew. And the first most important one was the site. Site factors made a big difference. And on the tablelands, the lower slope positions were really found to be the most difficult sites. Tree survival was low, tree growth tended to be low, and there was a number of reasons for that. One was lower parts of the landscape tend to accumulate the colder air, so frost was a problem. Also, that colder air kept the soils colder for longer during the year, so the growing season was effectively shorter. In wet periods, lower slope positions tend to get waterlogged, and so you had young trees sitting in soil that might have been waterlogged for a long period, and that makes it difficult for tree growth and survival. And the other important factor in low slope positions is that herbaceous competition is heaviest in those sort of slope positions. So competition from all of the plants that, any of the herbaceous plants are a problem when you're trying to establish woody plants, because they grow quite quickly early on in the season. Even after you've done a great preparation, if you don't do some proper weed control, they can quickly swamp the young seedlings. The next most important factor that we discovered with our work was that post-planting weed control. That was critical. Typical farmers at the time that we were doing that survey tended to do a great job in the preparation, plant the trees, have good fencing and guarding and all the rest, but tend to think that then their job was done once the seedling was in the ground and guarded, and shut the gate and walk away. And that can be a bad mistake, because if the weed control is not controlled after the trees are planted, they can quickly overcome the young seedlings, and especially in sites that have got a heavy herbaceous plant population, can really impact survival and growth rate. We found that even quite simple weed control techniques that kept the area weed free for at least the first growing season was important in getting good growth and good survival amongst the seedlings. Some simple spray equipment can be mounted on a bike, could be on a backpack, or even one of these simple garden sprayers will be fine. And a knockdown herbicide, just spray it around the plant like that, 1 metre or so in diameter, or even up and down the planting bed. As long as you can control those plants when they're small, that will give the next phase in that seedling growth will be unchecked by weed competition.
For me, a really important part of preparation is grass control. It's really important to get the right chemical, the right rate of chemical, or the right mix of chemicals to suit the job that needs to be done to kill the grass or the weeds. We just use a simple boom spray setup on the back of a four-wheeler. Look at your landscape, look at what other people have planted. It's about finding what will work, but going back to those basic principles of we don't plant a tree because we like it, we plant a tree in the right place for the right purpose.
So we're on Gordon Williams' place here at Eastlake, and he would have started the preparation of this planting bed a good 6 months before he needed to plant. And he would have done that with a couple of rips, deep rips, and an initial knockdown of the herbaceous plants with something like Roundup. So he would have sprayed these out in the autumn sometime, and then would have kept these planting beds weed-free through the winter, built up a bit of moisture, and then he would have done another spray just prior to planting, because there would have been a germination of a lot of winter-active herbaceous plants, so that come planting time, this planting bed would have been well aerated, built up a bit of moisture, weed-free situation, and then the seedlings would have gone into that. So that's an ideal sort of preparation. Site factors are important. Post-planting weed control was the next most important factor that determined growth and survival of the planted trees that we surveyed. And the third critical thing was site preparation.
Righto, we better just do this ripping thing. An important part of preparation for planting is ripping in virtually all cases as far as I'm concerned. And we just use a 3-tine ripper that we had made. The importance of ripping is to open up the ground to allow moisture to come into the ground. That's the really important part of it. So it is important normally to rip between 12 and 6 months prior to your planting or seeding operation. In this area, and it may be different in other areas, but in this area timing is I would normally plant 1st or 2nd week of September for hand planting, and 1st or 2nd week, maybe into October, from September through into early October for direct seeding. Watering on day 1. After planting, if your preparation and your ground preparation in terms of weeds is good, you shouldn't have to water unless it's a really bad drought, and then you can water maybe once, maybe twice at the absolute most. We always dig out a little dish so as that will hold water at planting time or hold water at rain. But the other really important thing, you'll notice that this tree is not planted in the rip line. We always plant to the edge of the rip line, or where the rip line has lifted the soil, we plant about 6 to 8 inches off the rip line. This means that your roots go into soil that's a bit loose, but they don't just run into a rip line and then end up with that J-rooting problem. Get a wind from the west, if it's J-rooted along the rip line, 10 years time they start to fall over. Well, as a general rule, we don't need to graze them for hazard reduction because normally our rainfall is high enough that we get enough green grass that fires aren't an issue in this area. But during the last drought, we did have quite a build-up of dry matter within that area, and we very strategically grazed those areas, which was quite helpful, of course, during the drought for a period of 3 or 4 days, occasionally a week, but we used young cattle less than 12 months of age.
We're at the Armadale Tree Group, and I've been associated with them for 20 odd years. They've been going for 35 years, and in that time I've produced millions of trees and shrubs. I've been a botanist since I was about 10, I reckon. We deal with a range of customers, from people who want to plant 10,000 trees this year down to someone who wants a replacement shrub for their backyard. We can give them a species or a selection of species that will work for their particular soil and climate. It is nice if somebody collects seed from their own property and brings it in, and we can propagate and grow that specifically from their soil and climate at the moment, because the future climate's going to be different. You can't march in and say, can I have 1,000 of this species? But if you come in a year earlier and say, I'd like 1,000 of these next year, then the organisation, the tree group, or whoever your nursery is, has the time to get the seed, prepare it and grow it on so it's suitable for planting. There are some landholders who know exactly what they want, and they've got a pretty good idea about the species they want. But for beginners, for people who haven't done a lot of this, it's not bad to come and talk to the tree group staff, have one of them visit and assess where you want to plant the trees and shrubs, and sort of identify whether it's the right soil, or where it is on the slope is a key factor.
Bill Borrtex, here in Angie. We're a family farm, 1,500 hectares run sheep, cattle and goat enterprises. The place was over-cleared sort of all last century and quite naturally clear. With our sites we try and do a whole farm plan of grazing and lanes and water infrastructure, and some of that fits in well with the riparian areas because they're fenced off already and fairly bare, and we put riparian trees and lomandra in those areas because they're excluded from stock already. And we're working on having areas, sort of hilltops and links for biodiversity within our farm plan from now on. With our site selection and our preparation, a lot of it's riparian areas, which is hard to rip and spray because of gullies, and it's in the flood zone and we're a little bit worried about erosion. So sometimes we just spray a circular metre and have that ready to sow, and we usually wait for a really good forecast of rain, or it's actually raining before we start planting. And then the most important thing after that is the first really good growing season is to control the grasses around those plants for that first season. Certainly every site's different, and we've got a fairly good resource base with people that know the species that have worked, so quite often I'll get someone from within Landcare to come and have a look and see which ones have worked and which ones haven't for all the different locations. Like the riparian area trees are completely different to ones on sort of red rocky soil on tops of hills, so we've got a fairly good support network to know which ones to plant. Certainly biodiversity and birds and insects, seeing a difference with the sort of only a limited number of plants straight away with things happening there, birds coming back in. Hopefully a food source for lots of different critters eventually. Yeah, it's as much fencing it off from livestock and letting it regenerate is just as important as having trees and aquatic plants.
In conclusion, I think it's just really important that we look at the whole farm as a system. Animals, plants, biodiversity, trees, all that sort of thing. It has to be part of that whole farming system. It's not something separate, and it needs to be financially viable to do it. And I think we can show what we've done here and what other people have done and are doing, that integrated, planned revegetation can be a very viable part of a productive agricultural system. I think in the last probably 10 or 15 years we have realised the importance of biodiversity within a whole farm landscape and how important that is, and there's good research work that's been done that shows if you've got animals and wildlife and birds and trees and the whole lot, that whole landscape becomes more resilient, and there's good evidence that would suggest that.